So, welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with the founders and leaders from some of today's top marketplaces. So, this is episode 156, which was a really incredible group chat that we just had with the one and only Casey Winters, who's, of course, a leading mind when it comes to product and growth for marketplaces. So, Casey is an advisor to marketplaces like Whatnot and Bounce, was most recently the chief product officer at Eventbrite. He's also worked with marketplaces like Faire, Hipcamp, Airbnb, Thumbtack, and many more as an advisor. So Casey was an early group chat guest, so this is great to welcome him back on, where he did a quick refresher on some of his product and growth experience early at Grubhub and then Eventbrite, with some of his key learnings were that he's taken with him to now advising marketplaces, discussed lots of topics like the importance of leveraging supply to help drive demand, how frequency impacts marketplaces, reviewed a sort of checklist for B2B marketplaces. Casey shared some of the biggest mistakes that he commonly sees marketplace founders make with growth. We also had a great group Q&A. So really enjoyed this conversation, and you're going to find it a great watch to the end. So Casey, you're of course one of the most referenced leaders when it comes to product and growth for our marketplaces. We're always talking about your posts here in the community. So, I'm really excited to have you join us here today, and would like to start off by saying a huge thanks for taking the time to do so in advance. So we have lots of topics that we're going to dive into. But before we do, I think it might be great if you can start off by sharing a quick kind of refresher on your background for those that might not know you outside of some of your posts.
Yeah, sure thing. And yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me. So I'm Casey. I started my career as an analyst at apartments.com, and it was my job to measure everything we did to drive leads to apartment buildings. So that's where I learned about all of these new techniques to grow software companies like SEO, SEM, affiliate marketing, email, all this kind of stuff. So naturally started working on optimizing those once I measured them and understood how they worked, and then started working on like making the website work better and seeing why people would still use Craigslist over us, and got this weird feedback at the time that I was a weird product and marketing hybrid, and that they didn't know what to do with that, and I should pick a lane, bro. And I didn't want to do that. So I started working on more entrepreneurial stuff that allowed me to kind of learn all the kind of soup to nuts user journey sort of stuff. And that's how I eventually found my way to startups. So I joined Grubhub after the 1 million Series A, and I basically led demand side growth from there. We called that marketing at the time, but later on we come up with a new term for it. So I did that basically from Series A to IPO. After that, I moved over to Pinterest and led the growth product team there. Now we had this term called growth for what I did, and basically rebuilt the growth model of Pinterest from a viral startup that had plateaued to a company that was growing on top of Google, and kind of rebuilt the growth model, got that to really scalable, from 40 million to 150 million monthly actives. Now it's like 500 million monthly actives. Then I started advising companies, mainly marketplaces. So I was working with Airbnb, Canva, Eventbrite, Thumbtack, Reddit, Hipcamp, basically on all sorts of scaling problems. So how to set up data appropriately, how to think about growth strategy, how to think about product development process. And I did that full time for a couple of years. But Eventbrite was one of my favorite clients, and they reorganized functionally, created a chief product officer role, asked me to take it. And then I took that job with absolutely terrible timing shortly before the pandemic began. Led product management, design, research, and growth marketing for 3.5 years. And then for the last year, have kind of gotten back into the advising mode, working again, mostly with marketplaces, Etsy, Faire, Whatnot, Bounce, and doing some angel investing on the side, again, mostly in marketplaces.
Yeah, no, that's a real incredible background. So thanks for sharing with us, and a lot we're going to get into here. And so you've of course worked with some of the most notable startups, and it seems like one of the commonalities is that they're marketplaces. So I guess what initially kind of attracted you to marketplaces, and why did you choose to focus on them?
Yeah, so I did a lot of work in retail when I was younger. I'm sure a lot of us cut our teeth in crappy retail jobs. And I took some like retail marketing strategy classes while I was an undergrad. And then I interned at apartments.com, and I realized we didn't have to own our inventory and how profitable a model that was. And I was like, this is genius. I will never work for a company that has to own inventory again. And, just when that's like your core business model, you can more efficiently create multi-billion-dollar outcomes, it turns out. And then I, of course, later learned some of the other key elements of marketplaces like cross-site network effects and liquidity. Um, and, that was, it turns out really important to understanding why the marketplace business model can be so successful as well. But it was kind of that aha moment was like, wait a minute, like if we don't need to buy a bunch of stuff and store it for a long period of time and then like eventually get rid of it, you could just build a way more profitable business than, what I was used to before.
It's going to be relatable with a lot of founders. We could probably go back through and have a group chat on, each of your specific kind of experience, not only at Grubhub, but also at Eventbrite. But, I guess, with all of that, if we kind of like zoom out to today, what are some of those kind of like key learnings or maybe lessons from your previous experience that you find yourself commonly sharing with founders?
Yeah. So one that like in every marketplace I start working with, I tend to have to do is teach them that aggregate metrics in marketplaces are useless. Metrics need to be refined by market or category or acquisition channel, or a combo of a bunch of them to be insightful. So you tend to need to get more sophisticated data-wise a lot more quickly in a marketplace model than a lot of other startups models. The second one I would say that comes up a lot is for marketplaces to win, they need some sort of edge in customer acquisition. That edge is usually unique content or unique data. And the reason for this is that marketplaces don't win on having the best software. Marketplaces win on having the best supply and the most demand. So customer acquisition on both sides of the marketplace is the entire game in some way. And that's like the biggest thing that's missing when you read like, Bill Gurley's marketplace factors, like, is if you don't have like some sort of cheat code to getting supply quickly and getting demand quickly and getting lots of it over time, your chances of building a big marketplace are relatively impossible.
That's actually a great kind of segue right into a few different topics that I wanted to, discuss here today. I guess, the first though, so, of course, always talking about the importance of demand for marketplaces. And, you recently shared a really great post with Dan Hockmar titled, the best way to drive demand in marketplaces is hidden in plain sight, which is, of course, about, using supply as a way to drive demand. So could you spend a little time maybe kind of walking us through that post and touching on some of the kind of key points and examples here?
Yeah. So if you need an edge to win big on customer acquisition of marketplaces, Dan and I described a commonly overlooked one, which is, can you get supply to drive that demand for you, at least partially? What's problematic about this approach, which is why it warranted a deep dive by both of us, is that if supply drives the majority of demand for your business, you no longer exhibit cross-site network effects. You are basically a SaaS fulfillment business that masquerades as a marketplace. So what does that mean? It means you'll have lower take rates. It means you'll have more supply side churn. It means you'll have a low demand side LTV. All of these things that create weaker outcomes. Doesn't mean you have a terrible business. Square is basically a SaaS fulfillment business that masquerades as a marketplace because it had to work with both the buyer and the seller. But at its core, these are generally subscale companies that cannot get or remain public if they don't exhibit cross-site network effects. And the way Square did it is by building more of a fintech business over time, not becoming more marketplacey over time. So Eventbrite, of course, had this problem when I joined. I went in eyes wide open. I knew it had this problem, and it was, I knew it was my job to fix it. But Eventbrite only drove about 15% of the demand to event creators when I started working with them, which meant the event creator was going and doing a bunch of its own marketing to bring people to Eventbrite to transact because we were the best transaction platform for event creators. So now that number has doubled. I think it's over 30% of the demand is driven by Eventbrite, but that's still not enough to become a cross-site network effect business that will compound your growth more easily. And it means Eventbrite still has a lower take rate than most of the marketplaces I've worked with. So The thing that's great about this model is demand side acquisition basically costs nothing. But because demand side acquisition is driven through supply, you generally aren't building that much of a direct relationship with the demand, helping them discover, in Eventbrite's case, new creators, but in generically new types of supply. And that's basically been the primary focus of the company Eventbrite now, which is, how do we build that direct relationship? But it's like building a new muscle from scratch. Like the entire company's been optimized around supply and supply-driven growth for so long. So with Faire, it's a company I advise. It's a company that, Dan works at full time. While supply drives demand through a program we call Faire Direct, the company's primary skill is cross-selling that demand to other supply to create the marketplace network effects. And that's working very well. So it feels like Faire drives a lot more of the demand to each supplier, even if most of the demand comes from, one supplier referring it into the marketplace initially. So that's like a really healthy sweet spot for a marketplace. And then with Grubhub, initially no demand came from supply. So we as Grubhub needed to drive all of it primarily through SEO and SEM. But we started doing things like building websites for restaurants that didn't have them, integrating them into Google Local, printing menus for them, printing signage for them, all of which was Grubhub branded, all of which went through Grubhub online ordering. And that drove up the amount of demand that came from supply over time and was, of course, very cheap, very cost effective. And then Bounce, which is another company I work with right now, they replicated that Google Local strategy from Grubhub quite effectively in the luggage storage space. Etsy is another company I work with that does this pretty well with their share and save model. So in all of these companies like Faire, Grubhub, Bounce, and Etsy, in order to make this model work, you have to incentivize the supply to do this work. So these programs have lower fees than a normal marketplace order that you went and spent the money to drive, because you're really just kind of doing fulfillment, not driving an incremental order. And sometimes you need to do more than just have better fees. You need to build SaaS software that makes it more efficient to use the marketplace for all the supplies orders. So Grubhub built tablets inside of every restaurant. Faire has fulfillment software with better payment terms, free returns. Bounce and Toro have insurance coverage you can't get if you go direct. So there's a bunch of these elements that you have to align to get supply-driven growth to go really well, but also remain in this Goldilocks zone where it hasn't moved you out of becoming a marketplace model. So, the post goes into some more detail than I'll cover today, but those are some of the main things we wanted to make sure people understand, because I think it's a relatively misunderstood but important concept. Is it necessary to build a great marketplace? No. Uber's just fine without supply-driven growth. But it turns out they have the biggest TAM in marketplaces, which is transportation and food. Both daily use cases that for every human in the world, right? But a lot of other marketplaces don't have that. So they're going to need something else besides, raising many billions of dollars during a zero interest rate environment.
Yeah, that's a really helpful walkthrough for us. So I appreciate it. So one of the things I wanted to discuss as far as like low frequency marketplaces, maybe, what you see some of the main challenges are that the low frequency marketplaces, face, and some of the, typical kind of strategies that can be used to overcome this, and maybe sharing a few examples if you can.
We've talked about the importance of owning demand, and it's very hard for low frequency marketplaces to own demand, because keeping a mind share in people's heads to go to you directly the next time they have the need is hard when last time they interact with you might have been a year ago or many months ago. So I wrote a post, it might have been 10 years ago now, on some of the strategies to overcome this. So one is you own the visibility on the networks people go to when they have this infrequent need. Historically, that's mostly been Google, but now TikTok, Reddit, Instagram, basically any network bigger than yours where your demand hangs out is a good place to try to get a ton of visibility. The Airbnb example is just having, even though it's a very low frequency marketplace, the product experience is so good that they will remember it 6 months later, a year later. And in the case of Airbnb, it was because it was cheaper than a hotel and in a cooler part of town. And then, the third is that if the frequency of transaction is low, it doesn't mean the frequency of usage of the product has to be low. You can build community or browsing behavior that's not transactional, that's more frequent, so that when the transactional need comes up, you're going to be top of mind. Zillow is the canonical example of this with this estimate, and creating, browsing home prices, a more frequent behavior, even though you don't buy homes, every 6 months. And then the last one I wrote about is making part of the value prop, basically like an insurance product. So you want to create a relationship where the user needs to have a relationship with this product for safekeeping when something goes wrong. Okay, so that's like how to solve the acquisition problem in a low frequency marketplace. Hopefully one of the four of those can work for you. But let's say you install one of these strategies, you should still be trying to sequence to higher frequency use cases over time. And most companies struggle with this because when you're a low frequency marketplace, you do a bunch of things to get viable. You optimize the company for immediate payback. You try to maximize the monetization on every visit. And those are the exact types of behaviors that will prevent you from building a product experience that people will build a direct brand preference for or openness to new value props from, right? So when you look at these big low frequency marketplaces, and a lot of the early ones were in travel, they're stuck in this like highly optimized growth model that cannot take them to new heights. They cannot like sequence to these different things the way that people who might have monetized a little bit worse, but crafted more on experience, have a more openness from their consumers, more direct traffic to say, hey, now we do this other thing so that you can use us many more times a year. So that's the thing I counsel founders on, which is like, you can over optimize low frequency marketplaces and you will cap hard on like ultimately how big a business you can build. And look, that might be fine. Like you might be a billionaire. It's cool. But generally, that can lock you out of some opportunities if you had been like a little bit more patient. It's like a marshmallow problem sometimes with low frequency marketplaces that, you have to make sure if you're eating the marshmallow now that that's really the right thing for you kind of short, mid, and long term.
It might be a helpful context though. If we were to say, a range of kind of frequency, how would you kind of define, low frequency marketplaces?
I would say the short term is kind of anything less frequent than monthly is low frequency, though it tends to be a little bit more binary in nature. Either you have monthly frequency or you have annual frequency. There isn't a whole lot in between. And the thing to keep in mind with low frequency marketplaces, you can build great businesses that are low frequency. I don't know what Airbnb's market cap is today, but I assure you it's a lot. So like it's not a death sentence in any way. But when you are a low frequency marketplace, every other component of the marketplace has to be way better to make up for it. So either your AOV, or your cost of acquisition, or your take rate. Like probably all three of those need to be better to make up for the fact that you're not having a high frequency of transaction, like say like a Grubhub or a DoorDash. And I've seen some founders do very well at optimizing the other ones because they can't really move frequency, and that's totally great. I'm like big proponent of that, but it just stresses the other parts of the model more when you can't get frequency high. You can get a lot of mistakes. You can make a lot of mistakes if your frequency is high.
No, certainly. And low frequency marketplaces are definitely have their own unique challenges. So another kind of, topic that I wanted to make sure we had some time to kind of chat about is B2B marketplaces. Because of course, we're seeing the rise of B2B marketplaces. There are a few great examples of those that, kind of have broken out, as you mentioned, one earlier, Faire, then also another being Flexport. So, what do you think are some of the, I would say like kind of requirements or sort of like checklists for B2B marketplaces?
I think a lot of the first generation of these companies like basically forgot to read Bill Gurley's marketplace factors before they started their companies, because like just because it's a B2B marketplace doesn't mean you can escape the fact that supply fragmentation is like generally the most important thing. So when you look at companies like Faire or Incredible Health or Upwork, or more recently companies like Heave, they have supply fragmentation. as a core of why they're able to create value in a marketplace. But a lot of these other companies that were created during like the zero interest rate environment, like Node or Material Bank, like it wasn't really clear that they had that. And when you don't have that, you try to do all this fancy SaaS work to try to unlock a marketplace value prop. And even when you do it, you can't monetize it well because there's just very little incremental demand to be driven. And a lot of times the frequency also isn't high on that demand. Like people do bulk orders every 6 months or whatever. So, so yeah, you kind of still need to go through the same sort of checklist, right? Of, do I have supply fragmentation? Do I have high frequency? If I don't have high frequency, am I getting my cost of acquisition really low? Because I have some sort of insane edge there in data or content that I can leverage. Usually that's hard in B2B because you're doing sales. So then you're like, okay, can I have a very high AOV? Usually easier in B2B, but then it's like, well, can I have a high take rate? And it's like, probably not, especially if supply fragmentation is low. It's generally hard to have a good take rate. So I think one of the insights of Faire, right, is they took a B2B marketplace that normally would do sales on both sides and they made it sales only on one side using this Faire Direct program to make referral the primary lever on the other side. So that's the type of thing you're looking for. I'd say what's different about consumer marketplaces is generally B2B marketplaces require the founder to have deep industry expertise before starting the company. So the Faire founders all worked at Square for years before starting Faire. They've been working with small businesses a ton. The Heave CEO was the COO at a construction company before starting a construction technician marketplace. You know, Aman, who I think, you know, has been on the chat, right, was like doing healthcare consulting and startup work for like many years before she started Incredible Health. Like, you generally need to be deep in that space to understand why it's got a stable equilibrium the way it works today. You got to want to change it, which some people in the industry don't want to because they're making too much money the way it works now. And then you need to have the insight on how it could work better and how you can apply a growth model to that that can actually get initial liquidity and scale it and all that kind of stuff. It's just hard to learn all of that in like 3 months of research.
Certainly. That's probably going to lead to some questions during the Q&As, because I know we have lots of B2B marketplace founders and kind of teams in the community. So speaking of, I know you and I could go on for quite some time here, discussing some of the kind of topics. So I want to make sure we can save time for the Q&A, since I promised founders that. But, right before we get into the group Q&A, so, you've of course seen so many different marketplaces and worked with some of the most legendary ones as well. So, when it comes to, mistakes that marketplace founders commonly make, what do you think some of those are?
Okay, so a couple that come to mind. One is scaling into new markets or categories without a detailed playbook of what it takes to reach liquidity and ultimately scale and supply demand afterwards. And too much reliance on manual operations to scale markets. Uber was the exception to the rule of how to scale markets, not the rule of how to manage individual markets with all these local people. It's too expensive. So that's one that I see a lot. The other is trying to simplify growth of a marketplace into one metric. You're like, oh, well, like the only thing that matters is matching supply and demand. It's like, no. You need to understand a large constellation of metrics, understand the trade-offs between them. They all need to be filtered by geo, category, acquisition channel, et cetera, to make sure you're making the right, decisions for your business that will create long-term growth, not just short-term growth. So those are probably the two that come to mind the most as like mistakes you see in building up a marketplace. Yeah.
Those are definitely going to be helpful. So we're going to just go ahead and jump right into the group Q&A, if that sounds good to you. Hey, John, I know I promised you could come on here. You want to jump on?
Yeah. Thanks for being here, Casey, and thanks for organizing, Mike. We actually traded notes on Twitter about the Substack Beehive thing with your recent article with Dan. So I love the demand aggregation stuff you've done. I'm the founder of a company called Leland, a coaching marketplace. We think a lot about category expansion. So you just barely alluded to this, and would love to talk a little bit about, or just hear your thoughts on what companies that pursue category expansion, not geo expansion. So like the Thumbtacks or whatnots. I guess Thumbtack is kind of both. What have they done uniquely well in category expansion to pull that off? And any common mistakes that you see?
Sure. So for those of you who are less familiar, Whatnot is a collectibles marketplace powered through live stream sellers. So basically all the transactions today are through a seller live streaming a bunch of their products, like let's say the vinyl, and then, triggering a bid process and then people bidding and buying that. So I think what allowed Whatnot to be successful where some of their early competitors failed is they had a very good understanding of the core attributes of their first category, which was Funko Pops, which probably half of you don't even know what that is, but it's like a weird kind of doll of like Marvel characters and other famous IP. So they understood that category really well because they were collectors themselves. They understood why it worked with their product. And then they used those attributes to map other categories that looked as similar as possible so that the product and go-to-market strategy could essentially be the same to unlocking the next category, which I think was Pokemon cards. I think was next, and then sport cards, and then sneakers and women's handbags. They're in a lot of stuff now. So they basically were like, hey, high-frequency collectibles buying and selling through existing communities on social media with a combo of entertainment, community, and commerce. They would probably phrase that way better than I just did, but you get a sense of like there's a lot of attributes there that they understand how they interplay because they were deep in the space already. And they're basically looking for things that look as close to that as possible that they could expand into. And therefore, they didn't have to change the product that much for it to work. They didn't have to change the go-to-market strategy that much for it to work. They could just kind of do what they'd already done again. So that's like the Whatnot example. The Thumbtack example is different. So Thumbtack had such a big edge on customer acquisition that they were like, the work we need to do to unlock demand in one category, which is SEO work, is fundamentally the same amount of work, whether we're in one category or 100. We're just creating a bunch of landing pages. We're getting them to rank number one on Google. So they kind of launched all of them at once. And one of the reasons they were able to do that is if people came in and filed a lead, they would just kind of manually email those leads to, professional suppliers and then use that as an excuse to onboard them onto Thumbtack permanently. And then from there, they were able to optimize the conversion rate on a category by category level. They built a big market development team that optimized all those conversion flows. But early on, it was like, we know how to rank high on Google for everything, local services. We're just going to go get those rankings before other people figure it out. And then we'll gradually automate the rest of the business, like supply, conversion rate, demand, all that kind of stuff. And, you're probably not going to find that opportunity in 2024, but, they're a little bit older business.
Awesome. That's a great question. So cool. Hey, David, you want to come on?
Thanks so much, Mike. Would love to just understand a little bit about any tips for earlier stage, lower frequency marketplaces in terms of how to build out and growing that network.
So I don't think there's relatively much different in building out the initial network for like a low frequency business versus anything else. You're trying to understand what liquidity looks like. And basically what liquidity looks like in any marketplace is always the same, which is what amount of value is created that will get supply and demand to happily engage and then feel good about that, that engagement with the marketplace. And then when that happens, like how do you measure that it actually was successful? And hopefully at least one side has a higher frequency component. So in a lot of low frequency marketplaces, it's really only one side that's low frequency, which is the demand side. Supply side's actually getting, business all the time. Sometimes that's not the case, like buying and selling a car, of course. I'm sure there are power sellers in car marketplaces, but I've never really spent time on it. So the trick with all of this for all marketplaces is that metric that indicates you've hit liquidity on supply and demand is kind of a custom metric for every business. It's always kind of related to first conversion and then some amount of conversion on one side. So like to take the Grubhub example, it was we had to get restaurants to 2 orders a day. And if we got them to 2 orders a day, they would never churn voluntarily. They might go out of business because that happens in small businesses, right? But like we got them 2 orders a day. That was very meaningful incremental revenue. And delivery is, despite what you hear in the press, highly profitable for restaurants because they can always pump out additional food in this fixed space that they're paying rent for. And then it turned out, Grubhub being a higher frequency marketplace, we need to get someone to order again for a second time in the first month to say we really unlocked product market fit on the demand side. So then you see those 2 metrics in a market, and then you're like, cool, we're ready to scale up restaurants, we're ready to scale up more users. So nothing's fundamentally different to me about low frequency marketplaces, except you might only get that frequency signal on one side, or maybe 0 sides. And if you're not getting the frequency signal, you need to have a qualitative measure of success. So like for apartments.com, which is really low frequency on the demand side, right? We had to make sure they actually found their place. So we had to get the signal on, did you find your place through us? And, did you actually make the move? And did you feel like you got good results, right? So a bit more qualitative survey-based approach. And then on the supply side, we measured the volume of leads that we sent them basically. And then every year we went and tried to charge them higher prices for those leads. And if we were able to charge them higher monthly fees for the amount of leads, we knew that it was working. So kind of our annual retention rate at higher prices was how we thought about that. So yeah, what's tricky with some of these just offline marketplaces in general is sometimes the real signal of like, that was a valuable transaction happens offline, and you need to find some way to try to qualitatively get that signal back, right? So for Airbnb, it was rating the trip. It's incredibly important on the demand side. That was the primary signal. And we had goals for that basically.
Thank you.
Hey, Casey, actually, I want to jump in here. I had a question that was added to the Google Doc, and it's a few founders actually asked somewhat related questions, but, the kind of like SaaS-first approach to starting a marketplace. So, building like a tool for the supply side and then trying to move into, layering on kind of demand and becoming a marketplace is becoming popular. Of course, we've also seen on like the other side, do you see that kind of like SaaS-first kind of approach working well? And I guess, like, are there any good examples of, when it has?
Absolutely not. I do not see SaaS-first working well. I think when you look at that approach, which I think was probably popularized by James Currier when he wrote about market networks, whatever that was, like a decade ago, I think it's largely been a disaster. I don't think there's any really big winners after a decade of that thesis being out there for a few reasons. 1, you tend to target low-frequency actions. 2, you tend to lack focus. 3, you tend to not add much value. And what that means is you are a mediocre SaaS business at best. I think one of the things you want to be focused on in thinking through this is generally you're focused on like SaaS to marketplace in some way because you're not sure you can unlock liquidity by just connecting buyers and sellers straight up. Either you can't get the supply because you're not creating enough value or things like that. So then you got to ask the question, like, does a marketplace really exist here? In a lot of cases, the answer is like, no. But let's say the marketplace does exist. Then you have to anchor in the company. The marketplace value prop is the primary value prop for everyone inside the company, for everyone outside the company, and that you are building SaaS to reduce the friction of creating successful matching and therefore transactions. So I remember having this conversation with Max at Faire. Oh, geez, this was probably like 2018. And it was like, we're like, hey, it's not SaaS to marketplace, it's marketplace to SaaS every time. Like, get the marketplace value prop right. And if you need SaaS to kind of pull in more people, increase frequency, whatever, improve your customer acquisition, yeah, go for it. But building a SaaS business and then this whole like, oh, well, step 2, I'm going to become a marketplace. Like, I think that thesis is full of shit. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying the chances of you getting it right are like, you're basically picking like harder than like building a consumer social network to scale from a product market fit perspective is trying to like execute on that thesis. Doesn't mean there won't be people that do it correctly. I think there's some where it's like jury's out, they might make it, but no like proven winners at this point. So I think there's a few reasons that's worth going through as to why that's generally a bad idea. One, you need to go get product market fit for SaaS. And yes, getting product market fit for SaaS is a lot easier than product market fit for marketplaces. It tends to happen quicker. The playbook is more developed, all that kind of stuff. But once you find product market fit for SaaS, you then got to go scale the product market fit, because you're probably still going to say, well, now that I have product market fit for SaaS, I still need way more customers on the supply side for that before I can kind of sell them this marketplace value prop. And then you find yourself running a SaaS business for like 7 years. And then you're like, cool, now's the time for it to become a marketplace. And now you have like 300 employees that only understand SaaS. Short-term goals that are still optimized around the SaaS business. And so then you're like, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this GM structure for consumer, and I'm going to carve these people off, and then they're not going to be distracted by the core SaaS business needs. And then 3 months, they get reorged back to some SaaS metric misses goal. And you need everyone, all hands on deck to get back to that goal. And so that team never has the runway to go build what many times is going to be like 3 years worth of consumer product. So it's a rough one for me. I'm not a big fan. I think the way to do it is like everyone you onboard that's building a SaaS business, you have to tell them basically the SaaS business we're building ain't shit. It only matters if it helps the marketplace model. So everyone that's building SaaS short-term, which is really long-term, it's going to be like 5+ years, he's doing it for this marketplace holy grail. They're not getting distracted by thinking supply is their main customer, because it isn't. Demand is the main customer. This is just like a really long sequence. I think people will get better at this, but all of that first generation, like you go inside the company and then you see that like no one at the company understands marketplaces. It's just a SaaS business telling a VC story that's eventually going to become a marketplace. So that's like not gonna unlock, right? So again, second generation is probably going to be better, but like talk about trying to build a business on hard mode. Like I hate it.
No, marketplaces are hard enough, right? Why make it harder? So
yeah, it's like go build a consumer social business if you're a masochist. Like it's probably easier than this.
yeah, certainly. So cool. We're gonna try to squeeze in one last question if we can. Hey, Peter, I saw you raise your hand there. You want to come on?
Thank you very much. And brilliant talk, Casey. Just for quick context, I'm Peter, one of the founders of MyArc, where we enable fitness creators to train their fans at scale. We've helped the supply side already make more revenue than they ever have in any of their social media, which is great. So lots of value between supply side and demand side, and also our supply side has acquired the demand side very, very quickly as well. So kind of zero CAC, for any consumer, which is great.
Yeah.
We're kind of operating in what I would say like a silo mode at the moment, where right now, when the fans come on, they don't see other creators. They just see that main creator they signed up via.
Yeah.
But what we're noticing is that a lot of the consumers are starting to realize that there are other creators in our kind of MyArc universe and wanting to kind of go around and switch around. My question is kind of around, I feel like it might be too early to pull the trigger on having that type of like discovery or that kind of cross networking, and instead maybe focus on like the initial network effects that we can do on a per community basis, if that makes sense. Because what we're seeing is that the social mechanics that we've kind of just released of community, etc., is getting, retention and activation a lot higher. People are creating so much UGC that the creators then put on their post, and that's bringing in like organically more customers. So kind of diving a bit deeper into that, almost like a Strava-like interface within the experience, and then going towards kind of marketplace. But yeah, that's kind of what we're thinking at right now. So currently operating in silo, we're seeing network effects within the kind of creator to fan kind of community, and wanting to know when to kind of, or maybe it's a bit too early to pull trigger on like that more traditional marketplace and discovery.
Yeah. Okay. So the question you have to work through to build the appropriate strategic sequence here is, it sounds like you have traction in building out acquire creator onboards community, community starts engaging with each other. That's a direct network effect business, right? And that's valuable. All direct network effects are valuable. And so the question is, do I lean into that? But there is some emergent behavior. It's that maybe has high traction. So you could lean into that a lot more, and that will create defensibility and faster growth, all things we love. But then there's also some emergent behavior that implies you could have cross-site network effects, which is cross-selling creators. And what's nice about that is maybe like the acquisition isn't as viral or anything as a direct network effect business, but the cross-sell will create higher take rates from suppliers because they feel like you're actually driving real demand to them versus just managing a community. So probably will make more money per creator. And you will probably see metrics over time that show the number of creators you get connect with, the higher the consumer side retention is for, the overall kind of product. So the LTV on the consumer side will go up. LTV on the consumer side is going to go up through the direct network effects too, but probably the cross-site network effects will be a little bit higher, assuming you're maintaining some balance of the community product. Probably makes sense to like achieve some milestone on the community side to feel like you're headed into this returns and then sequence to better discovery, unless you feel like the fact that you're not doing that means someone else is going to like that opportunity will go away, right? Like if you don't lean into it, it'll kind of evaporate for some reason. I don't think it would evaporate competitively. Like, I don't think it's not like someone else is going to steal that opportunity. It's just more that people, it's generally been hard to balance historically, like community value prop and transactional value prop. Obviously, Whatnot's doing a pretty good job at this, but historically it's been pretty hard. Twitch is more on the community side, eBay's more on the transactional side. They were the first to have been able to blend the two quite well. So I think your prioritization probably sounds correct, but you're going to need to kind of reevaluate what are the gains from investing in building out the direct network effect? When does it feel appropriate to sequence to the cross-site network effect? So the other thing about the cross-site network effect I would keep in mind is getting good at matching is a pretty unique skill. And you talk to any marketplace founder and they'll just tell you how much they think their search functionality sucks and their discovery functionality sucks because there aren't enough good search engineers in the world. They're frankly all in China. So they're hard to get. And obviously machine learning and AI is propagating more and that stuff will become easier. But fundamentally just search is a hard problem. Matching is a hard problem. So you might want to get some work on that a little bit earlier, just knowing it's going to take a while to get good. Not distract from the core strategy, but if like, hey, if this is a call option, we're definitely calling in 3-year time horizon. It might take 3 years to get good at search, and browse and connect. So, now there are hacks to that, like take like the Substack model, right? Of like, well, if you follow one person, that person just recommends other people they think are good. That's usually like a good short-term hack, but not as much a game changer as you kind of owning the discovery model long-term.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks. That's a great last question. I'm glad we could mention cross-site network effect. So get that in as well. So, well, cool. Well, Casey, I know we're out of time here, so definitely want to be conscious of that. But, it was once again a real treat to have you join us here today. So I really appreciate, taking the time to do so. As I mentioned, your posts are always being shared here in the community, as you can see, and, we're always discussing them. So I can only imagine how busy you are, but definitely please keep them coming because they're super helpful for us all in the world of marketplaces. And, I actually had one last kind of question for you before we wrap things up, which is, if you could go right back to before you entered the world of marketplaces, what would you tell yourself about them specifically?
Good question. So I think one thing I had to learn as, kind of like a product growth sort of guy, is like marketplaces don't win on features. They win on connecting supply and demand. And in all marketplaces, supply only cares about one thing, which is more business, which means more demand, which means if you're not driving more demand and finding a way to make that more attractive to supply, you're probably not doing an important thing long-term at the company. So I had, all these feature ideas for Grubhub and we built some of them. And I think net that created negative $1 billion of outcome for the company because of how distracting it was. And that's like sobering to tell other like product leaders and marketplaces, come like, all this skill you have, don't use it. Just don't ever use it. You have to just like grind on more users, more suppliers forever. And I'm super comfortable with this as like a marketplace product leader. But for some people, like, it's a little bit uninspiring to like internalize that. And I went through my change curve on that, like, whatever it was, like 13 years ago. But I definitely had to learn that the hard way at Grubhub. Even at apartments.com, I built like a whole, non-transactional community product for apartments.com. Total failure. Yeah. A lot of our product skills just don't matter in marketplaces. It's an optimization game. Doesn't mean you're not strategic, but it means you got to be building something that is going to create more demand or create more supply, or it's fundamentally the wrong thing.
I mean, I couldn't think of better parting advice. So we once again really appreciate it. And last but not least, time for a quick plug. Where can we keep up with you at?
Well, my blog is caseyaccidental.com. And I'm not really like, I don't really like tweet a lot or do any of that like LinkedIn, I woke up one morning and realized I had a working capital problem bullshit. But like, so like mainly my LinkedIn and Twitter is used to say like, I wrote something new, and I write something new probably once every couple of months. So I'm not that frequent, but yeah, so probably just the blog directly, but you can always find out, when I write something new on Twitter or on LinkedIn. Yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. I'll include links in the recap post here and the details. So thanks again for joining us here, and thanks everyone for the great questions.